Welcome to World of Stories, a podcast about how stories shape our lives. I'm Eileen, and my pronoun is she.
I'm Margrit, and my pronoun is they. Hi, Eileen. How's it going?
Hi, Margaret. It's still going.
That's good, I think, although it's hard to tell anymore. But the good is that we've managed to pull off a second season, and we're both still surviving the pandemic. So this episode, we're wrapping up and thinking about what we think and hope the post-pandemic world will look like.
You know, it's been helpful to discuss these issues because the discussions have helped me manage my expectations for what my life should look like during the pandemic. But the truth is that living through this has not gotten any easier. You'd think that I'd have developed some coping mechanisms by now, but I totally haven't. And somehow it feels harder now than when it first started.
Do you think that's pandemic fatigue, or would that be too flippant a term for this period of time when so many people are dying or experiencing life-changing trauma?
I don't think it's flippant. I think it's true. At first, a lot of us were psyched about hunkering down and beating this thing. Like, we knew how important it was, and we were ready to band together and do what we needed. But then 1 month dragged into 6 months, which dragged into a year. And now we're 15 months into it. And I've totally run out of steam. Like, all I want to do is to be able to walk into a store and pick up the things I need. I don't want to have to pre-plan my errands with online orders and curbside pickups. And I don't want to be judged every time I'm outside because, oh, maybe I have COVID or I don't. I don't know. The whole thing is just too much. I can't handle it anymore.
It's exhausting. It's exhausting.
So exhausting.
Because in Toronto, we've had so many lockdowns that have been so long, and it feels never ending, to the point that we can't imagine what it will be like to be rid of this pandemic. And I'm sure that might be true in other places as well. But in Toronto, we've been in strict lockdown, don't leave your house kind of lockdown unless you really have to, since November 2020, and it's now June 2021. And before that, we only had a tiny little respite where the stores were open for 2 weeks. And I haven't had a haircut since August 2020. So almost a full year. And yeah. So let's talk about what we hope will happen after the pandemic ends. It doesn't really have to be realistic. Our hopes don't have to be realistic. So
yeah. Well, one thing I've been worried about for a while now is that I really think that there's going to be lasting trauma after the pandemic is over. So even when we get to herd immunity and stores and offices are open again, we're going to have to deal with the mental toll that the pandemic has taken on us. And especially for those who've gotten sick, or for those who have had loved ones pass away, they're going to have to learn how to continue on in their new reality. And for folks in the healthcare industry, they're super burnt out. And I think the healthcare industry is going to look very different going forward. And because of this, I hope that we can be more gentle with ourselves and with others. And I hope that we're more aware of what people are going through, even if they look okay on the surface. Because the pandemic has highlighted so many of the inequalities in our society, the hope would be that it's garnered more compassion for the struggles of those around us.
Yeah, I really hope you're right as well. And so, one of the things about compassion is seeing how many people have embraced shopping locally, so that the stores, like the small independent stores and restaurants around us, don't die. That haven't been open to walk-ins since November in Toronto. This might be my social media echo chamber, but a lot of my mutuals have highlighted their local consumption, and I also deliberately changed my shopping habits and made a point of buying all gifts from local stores, and trying to, although I've been cooking more, trying to also make sure that I'm getting takeout from local restaurants on my street and whatnot.
Yeah, same. Me too. I'm always trying to shop local whenever possible to support the smaller stores or to order food from restaurants, even though I have also been cooking a lot more than eating out. Um, the other thing I know that the pandemic has done is moved us toward greater accessibility, particularly through online platforms, which is really great. And I know that a lot of organizations are planning to maintain some sort of online programming or streaming even after they start meeting in person, which I'm really excited about.
Yeah, absolutely. And for example, captioning is default on TikTok and Instagram
hmm
stories. So is alt text on Twitter, all good developments.
Yeah, those are some really good examples. But one thing I have been thinking about is international travel because I've heard that the travel booking sites have seen an uptick in activity, which means that people are gearing up for getting back on planes. And there's even like new airlines that are popping up in Canada to take advantage um, of this trend of other airlines that have gone under, and so they can like snatch up inventory on the cheap. But like, I'm just like, people getting on planes, like, that's a very small enclosed space with recycled air, and it just feels so counter to everything we've been trying to do for a year and a half. And so I have zero desire to get on a plane anytime soon, um, at all. Just no desire to get on a plane. Also, it might have to do with the fact that I used to travel constantly for like 6 years, and so I'm totally over it. Um, but like Toronto, Ontario, there's so much to explore and discover, and I feel like I've been robbed of that for the past 2 years, and I really want to make up for it.
Mm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I'm a huge fan of Toronto in the summer, and in the pre-pandemic era, the city really came alive in the summer. It looked like everyone was outside, and we had
hmm
like street fairs and events every weekend, and that was amazing. So it really you really didn't need to travel during the summer. But I wonder if so many of us who felt bound by the pandemic won't take the opportunity to flee to places far and wide. So I have to confess to some wanderlust myself. I feel the need to see something different than I have for the past year and a half. And I'm not saying I'm going to jump on a plane, but I do want to travel, like road trip.
Yeah, sign me up. I am definitely down for a good road trip and seeing some of this amazing land that we live on because goodness gracious, this land is precious. And if you didn't know that already, certainly the real estate prices in Toronto should have given you some indication because they have just skyrocketed in the past year. They were already high, but they've just become astronomical during the pandemic. And so one aspiration is like hopefully housing prices will come back down to something a little more affordable. What do you think? Is that possible?
What a pipe dream to hope people should afford to live in the city they work in.
Mm,
I'm being sarcastic because honestly, I don't know how to process the ridiculous rise in housing prices in Toronto. Like even during the pandemic where all the newspapers like people are moving out of the city and into the country for affordability and it's like, but how do the prices still go up and up and up in Toronto? And I think affordability will shape our post-pandemic work landscape and I really hope to see a balance there more than a push from one side. Like, for example, a lot of people are enjoying working from home, but others really want to go back to a workplace. So, if you're living in, like in a shared apartment or a one bedroom, you really want to get out for your work, I think sometimes. And I fear that ultimately it's not going to be people's actual wants and needs that are going to drive the post-pandemic workplace. And I think this connects to how unaffordable it is to live in the city because a lot of people don't have the luxury of affording a home office. And I really do hope that workplaces recognize that and offer a real choice rather than externalizing the cost of renting an office onto the employees.
Yeah, it goes back to the question of accessibility, right? Like some people work better from home and some people work better in an office, and workplaces should be able to accommodate those differences to allow people to be more productive. Not that productivity is the goal, but that they can be happier with their working conditions. And with the pandemic, we've definitely proven that there's no reason why people all need to be in the same place, working at the same time, in the same way. So I don't know, maybe if there's less demand for office space, some of that can be converted into residential buildings. Maybe. Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, but I think that the workplace accessibility conversation also brings us to how the pandemic has highlighted the need for leisure time. And again, not just the separation of work and personal time, but like we need leisure time to recuperate from everything from work, from stress, from trauma. And I think that people will be embracing this as the economy opens up and we're allowed to get out again.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we talked about this in episode 3, where we mentioned like the nap ministry and how we need rest for ourselves, not for productivity. And I'm with you on the hope that that will become normalized.
Yeah, definitely. Because it's not just break from work, it's break from life, from responsibilities. And I, for one, definitely need that.
Yeah. We need to rediscover what needs we have, right? In order
Hmm.
to have a good life, because we've been merely surviving, waiting to get through and hoping very hard that what we do helps us and our loved ones not get sick, and being distraught when it did. And now we need to turn to rebuilding ourselves or whenever the pandemic ends, because even if things are looking good right now in Ontario and in Canada and other places, they're not looking as good in other places. So our health mentally and physically and also societally, I think we need to think about that deeply. So I don't think there's any going back to what we were used to before the pandemic, but we can move on differently, hopefully with more care for ourselves and each other. So can we imagine what this care for one another looks like in terms of policy? And what I'm thinking about is how much, for example, the rhetoric that was trying to keep us locked down was about keeping our loved ones safe. But what if our loved ones would mean more than our family? What if we enlarged that circle? How would we scale up this care for our community to something that would be like policy and a legal framework to care for our communities?
I think that would be wonderful if we were able to redefine family as more than just those who are biologically related to us, but expanding it to mean our neighbors and our coworkers and those who inhabit the same space as us. And I mean, the truth is that we're all interconnected and so much more than we realized pre-pandemic. So, like, for example, we order something online, but the item doesn't just magically appear on our doorstep, right? Like, there are people
Hmm.
who work in factories to manufacture the product, people who move the product to fulfillment centers, people who package your order, people who deliver your order to your home, and all of these people whom you'll probably never meet. But what if they were also considered your family, as a part of your family, and influence how you behaved and how you made decisions? I think that would be revolutionary. That would really change the way the world works. But unfortunately, I don't think that people will be able to do that. I think it's asking too much of a society that cares primarily about itself.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I agree. I think we've lived in a culture of individualism for so long. It will be very hard to turn to a more altruistic, socially engaged view of the world. And I think some of the reactions have been like turn into yourself and sort of circle the wagons, and because of the pandemic, rather than be like, oh, we're so connected, we should really think more broadly. And so I want to go back to this idea of relationships and think about the friendship episode that was episode 6 this season, where we talked about the need to extend the same legal protections to friendships and other
Hmm.
relationships as we do to monogamous romantic partnerships. And I do hope for more meaningful relationships, even at work, post pandemic, rather than just, networking.
Hmm.
Yeah, so if we do, like you were saying, build this awareness of understanding the interconnectedness, maybe the way that our relative privilege works, maybe we can shift our perspectives.
Mm. So I think, I mean, obviously, we don't want there to be another pandemic, like ever, hopefully. But the reality is, there's probably going to be some sort of like disaster of some sort that we will have to deal with as a society, as a community, or whatever. And I think one of the lessons I hope that um, leadership and government has learned is that there needs to be an interdisciplinary response. You know, like public health is very good at what it does, but to manage something as complex and as all encompassing as a pandemic, having only public health respond is not enough.
Hmm.
We have to include people who are trained in different areas, like economists and sociologists and psychologists and um, all sorts of people, like urban planners, even,
Hmm.
to really understand how do we have a response that is effective um, and as least disruptive as possible.
Hmm.
So, like, for example, understanding that a shorter but more stringent lockdown could work better and cost less than a really long, dragged out semi lockdown that is like allows the pandemic to continue festering, right? And so
Absolutely.
I really do think that we need to think more broadly about how to share resources, even like vaccines and PPE and um, all of those things, like not hoarding it in a self serving way, but making sure there's equitable distribution so that people across all socioeconomic backgrounds within our community and also globally have access to these things. Because as it's like clearly uh, made plain to us in this pandemic, that we are a globally connected world, and what happens on the other side of the world affects us.
Hmm.
And so we can't manage a global pandemic um, without sharing resources globally. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's got to be an all hands on deck approach.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's actually not self-serving to do that because while we're getting vaccinated here, people elsewhere are not, and new variants pop up. And so you have to really realize that even if you have the resources, if you're hoarding them, you're not doing yourself any favors.
No,
So
exactly.
if you do want to look at
Exactly.
it from the self-interest point of view, you have to share. You should share. So.
Yeah. So, Margaret, what's our recommendation for the episode?
My recommendation of the episode is Merlin Sheldrake's Entangled Life: How Fungi Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds, and Shape Our Futures. And I'm going to read two excerpts because they showcase exactly some of the things that we were talking about: the interconnectedness, the need for interdisciplinarity to understand our world. And it's funny that these come from a book about, mushrooms. Um, but I
Uh,
really, really would like people to read this book. It's really cool. I've actually listened to the audiobook, which is narrated by the author, and then I went out and bought the book because it just said so many cool things. So here's the first excerpt. It showcases what the book is about for me, or what I'm taking from the book. This is from the chapter called "What Is It Like to Be a Fungus?" For humans, identifying where one individual stops and another starts is not generally something we think about. It is usually taken for granted, within modern and industrial societies at least, that we start where our bodies begin and stop where our bodies end. Developments in modern medicine, such as organ transplants, worry these distinctions. Developments in the microbial sciences shake them at their foundations. We are ecosystems composed of and decomposed by an ecology of microbes, the significance of which is only now coming to light. The 40-odd trillion microbes that live in and on our bodies allow us to digest food and produce key minerals that nourish us. Like the fungi that live within plants, they protect us from disease. They guide the development of our bodies and immune systems and influence our behavior. If not kept in check, they can cause illness and even kill us. We are not a special case. Even bacteria have viruses within them. Even viruses can contain smaller viruses. Symbiosis is a ubiquitous feature of life. So I thought this kind of encapsulates not only what the book is about, but exactly what we were talking about in terms of individuality and what a fake idea it is, and also how we need to look beyond relationships to different things.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to end with another excerpt that talks about exactly what you mentioned earlier, the need for holistic views, need for interdisciplinarity, and how that can shape the way that we see the world. So this is a paragraph from towards the end of the book, a chapter called Making Sense of Fungi. And this is what it says. Sometimes we imitate the world without conscious effort. Dog owners will often look like their dogs. Biologists often come to behave like their subject matter. Since the term symbiosis was first coined by Frank in the late 19th century, researchers studying the relationships between organisms have been coaxed into forming unusual interdisciplinary collaborations. As Sapp pointed out to me, it was an unwillingness to make daring leaps across institutional boundaries that contributed to the neglect of symbiotic relationships for much of the 20th century. As the sciences became increasingly professionalized, disciplinary chasms separated geneticists from embryologists, botanists from zoologists, microbiologists from physiologists. So this goes back to exactly what you were saying earlier. If we're going to face this again, we can't just have public health do all the work, lift all the hard all the hard burdens, because it is all about how our lives are interconnected, and how the questions that we're asking when we're boxed up like this will never truly lead to understanding the world. In this case, in this book, it's about fungi, but we can always extrapolate. So we have to do away with the artificial boundaries between disciplines, between relationships, between people, and maybe we can build a better future.
That is a really, really interesting way of mapping the micro onto the macro.
Mm-hmm.
Because, fungi are small, so they're like micro.
Absolutely,
and then
yeah.
Macro, like the world. Ha ha. I'm funny. Anyway, our question of the episode is, what are your hopes, dear listener, for the post-pandemic world?
As always, you can join the conversation on Twitter at world_of_stories, or you can email us directly at worldofstoriespodcast@gmail.com. If you like our show, please share the podcast with your friends. You can rate and review World of Stories on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and all other major podcasting platforms. The more reviews we get, the easier it will be for new listeners to find us.
And lastly, if you'd like to partner with us in producing the podcast, we appreciate every contribution, no matter how big or small. You can donate at ko-fi.com/worldofstories. Thank you so much for listening. And until next season, stay safe.
And thanks for tuning into our second season, in which we try to figure out how to human in a pandemic.